Welcome to Chapter 10, Interpersonal Attraction, from First Impressions to Close Relationships for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In the first half of the chapter, we'll be talking about how people decide who they want to like and who they want to know better. So it's like, how do relationships start? Learning Objective 10.1 will be broken up into two separate videos because this part of the chapter is fairly long. So we're going to start with exploring what causes attraction to occur, and there is no shortage of theories as to why people are attracted to one another, either for friendship or for more than friendship. There are lots of explanations, everything from genetics and evolution to casual interactions that are shaped by similarity or even proximity. So lots and lots of theories. One thing we know for sure is that people tend not to do well when they don't have meaningful relationships in their lives. So on average, people report that when they don't have a solid base of really strong connections with at least one or two people, they tend to feel lonely, hopeless, helpless, powerless, alienated, etc. They're also more vulnerable to things like depression and anxiety as well. So in this chapter, what you're going to be learning about is what are the things that predict when attraction is more likely. So what kind of situational variables are going to predict it? What is it like for when people move from their first meeting to additional interactions into what we could call close relationships, whether it's close friendships or more intimate relationships between partners. So we're going to start with some of the simple situational variables that predict who we want to spend our time with based on our attraction to them. Now, before I dive into what the propinquity effect is, one of the things you're going to notice about this chapter that will frustrate you, or at least I think it will, because it frustrates me. It's always struck me that this chapter, it's kind of like the psychology of the first date is the majority of the chapter. And the simple reason is, for why that is, it's really easier in the laboratory to study first acquaintances because we can set it up. We can set people up with each other and see who they like and why. We can map out first acquaintances and short-term kinds of interactions. What's way harder for us to study empirically is love relationships, long-term friendships, deep committed relationships, and so on. And that's why your chapter is so heavy on the dating side of the equation, but also on the early dating side of the equation. The overwhelming majority of this research has been done with undergraduate participants. That means you're talking about people on average between the ages of 18 and 21 or 22. And those are individuals who are obviously young, in comparison to, say, people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, relatively inexperienced in terms of long-term relationships. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as you're working your way through this chapter, that there's a lot about attraction and love and liking that we don't know as much about as we do about the early stages of getting to know someone. So back to situational predictors of liking. One of the simplest predictors of who you're going to end up being attracted to, either for friendships or something more, is how close they are to you physically. That's called propinquity. There have been a lot of studies of what's now called the propinquity effect. And the idea is that the more times you interact with, even casually, the more times you see and run into people, the more likely they are to become your friends. So one of the earliest studies of this, they took at MIT, they had married student housing. So you had couples in a housing setting. And what they wanted to find out was after move-in, they did some assessments, and then they waited until later in the term it may have been the next semester. I'll have to fact check that. But they waited a significant amount of time and then asked, who are your closest friends? And for 40+% of them, it was their next door neighbors. Then 22%, 2 doors apart, 10% opposite end of the hall. So what that says is who you run into the most, who you have the most eye contact with, who you run into at the doorways, is going to be more likely, just based on propinquity, to be someone you become close with and spend more time with than people who are stretched out. Now, similar findings have been published about neighborhoods. So if you kind of take your standard suburban neighborhood and you ask people, who are you closest to, it tends to be predicted by propinquity. Like, people are far more likely to say that they're close to their next door neighbor or their across the street neighbor than they are to someone several doors down or on another street in that neighborhood, unless they had some pre-existing relationship with them before moving in. Now, what drives the propinquity effect is something called functional distance, and that refers to the degree to which the space, as it's set up, so whether it's a building, and that refers to architectural design, if it makes it more likely that certain people are going to come into contact with each other, they're more likely to like one another and be friendly with one another, and they're also more likely to seek engagements outside. Now, you can also take the functional distance idea out into the world, not just in a building, but in a neighborhood. And you can track the same kinds of effects, where if you design a neighborhood so that you have houses that face each other more often, so like the cul-de-sac idea, people are more likely to have interactions with the people that they see. So if we see them more, we tend to like them more. Now, that kind of runs counter to all of the narratives in these horrible stories of really awful neighbors, but typically when we can see people more, we tend to like them more and engage in more interactions with them. Part of what's going on with the propinquity effect is just simple mere exposure. Now, here's a weird example, and it sticks in my mind because I lived it. When I was in graduate school, and this is a photo, no, the bell tower back here is not crooked. The sculpture is. And yes, this is a sculpture. This is a sculpture called Greenpoint by an artist named Richard Serra. It's at the University of Nebraska, where I went to graduate school. It's two giant pieces of metal. So it combined, they weigh a lot. And when we first saw the sculpture, it was literally laying on the flatbed trucks. Pulled up next to the building. We thought, oh, they must be doing some sewer work. and then they stuck the pieces on end, crooked, in the middle of campus. And the reaction was immediate and negative toward the sculpture. That first semester, the favorite activity related to the sculpture was to go steal a toilet from somewhere. Who knows where people were finding the toilets, but to steal a toilet and put it in the middle of the sculpture and then, post signs or whatever. Usually it was just a toilet. Over time, though, it has become beloved. So people will come and visit campus and they want to take their picture standing in the middle of the sculpture with the bell tower in the background. There are promotional materials for the university that use the sculpture. So the initial hatred for it, the jokes about it being sewer pipes and then adding a toilet to it, faded away, and it has become a photo op spot for people. So that's a classic example of how mere exposure can eventually breed liking. Another variable that is really strongly tied to attraction is how similar we perceive other people to be to us. And this is consistent with, standard folk wisdom. the idea that birds of the feather flock together, or whatever phrase you want to use. Generally, we try to look for people who are like us to spend our time with. And part of this, evolutionary theory would say you want to look for people who, at least on the surface, appear similar. And then once you dig below that surface a little bit, the more similarities you uncover, the safer you are, and the more you can count on that person to have your interests in mind. So there's some biological reasons for similarity. There are also psychological reasons. We tend to feel more comfortable, safer with people who are similar to us. Like, we'll have something to talk about. We feel less anxious when we're around similar people as well. Now, folk wisdom also has the opposite prediction, that people who are not like each other will be drawn together because they are complementary. Now, contrary to what, the Hollywood image of the of couples coming together who are utterly and completely opposite, like opposite in terms of their traits, characteristics, their values, their beliefs, their cultural backdrop, whatever, that kind of opposites almost never predicts attraction in research studies, with large groups of people. There are always exceptions. You will always be able to point to that couple who, on the surface at least, look really, really different from each other and seem different as well in terms of their behavior, their interests, and so on. In some cases, because the key word here is complementarity, in some cases you can have people that on the surface appear to be very different, but when you get down to the level of core values and beliefs, they're very, very similar. So they may have a lot of different interests, different hobbies, different careers, different backgrounds even, but if you open up the hood and look underneath, what you'll find is that people often have the same deep structure values. The idea of complementarity comes into play when you have people in friendships or in intimate relationships where you have, one person who has a certain set of skills, the other person has a different set of skills, and they are not contradictory. They actually complement one another. Like I have a couple who are friends of mine. The man in the couple is very, very introverted, very quiet, very reserved. The woman in the couple, super outgoing, very, very sociable. And they're complementary in the sense that he tends to allow her the space to calm and relax and take advantage of his low-key style. And he gets the advantage of stretching himself and getting out into social interactions more often. So that kind of complementarity actually is attractive to people, but outright complete opposites, not so much. So what the research evidence shows is that overwhelmingly similarity wins the day. Complementarity can work, but only under the circumstances where underneath the surface differences, there are common beliefs and values hidden inside, and those need to match up. Otherwise, relationships founded on complementarity alone tend not to last very long. Like similarity, when we look at similarity, we have to think about different forms of similarity. The more similar people are in terms of lots of issues, the more you're going to like them. So part of what's happening with similarity is that the more time you have with another person, the more nuggets of similarity you're going to pull out. Early on, if you find that you're just not finding that similarity, that's when people tend to either dig super hard or they just abandon the relationship or don't pursue it. So the more similar people are to you on values, attitudes, beliefs, the more you tend to like them. We do tend to also be attracted to people who have interpersonal styles. So their behaviors in interactions with other people tend to match our own. Now, I mentioned this couple they're friends of mine that have complementary communication and interpersonal styles. Things work for them because they both aspire to be more like each other. And that's a core value of theirs. Generally speaking, when people have very different interpersonal and communication styles, it tends to cause friction and misunderstanding. So we like to have similarity in those areas. Also, when people have similar interests and activities in common, it gives them things to engage in together so that they can speak a common language and enjoy liking the same things at the same time. Like when I first met my husband on our first date, we're driving and he does that. He was very nervous. I was very nervous. And he just sort of said, "So what kind of music do you like?" Because he was trying to pick a radio station. And I was like, anything but smooth jazz or, and I'm not too fond of country music either. And he was like, "Oh, phew, that's great." And then we talked for a while about bands that we like. And we had a lot of similar bands that we listened to when we were kids and when we were adolescents. And then we got to talking about sports. And I was telling him how I was raised on, baseball and football was something I did that I watched on TV with my dad. And it was an important part of our relationship. And he was like, "Oh, I live for baseball and I love football." So we had similar things in common. Not that we didn't have differences. I was a farm kid. He was a city kid growing up. I had horses and he had to pass the riding my horse test to make it to stage 2 dating. There were differences, but on some of these key aspects, like, how we felt about the world, our values, our beliefs, we match really, really well. So that similarity is kind of like, not just on the surface, but underneath too. Now, something you might not have considered as a predictor of attraction or liking is genetics. And this is relatively speaking newer research, kind of looking at the biological bases of attraction. What we do know from, kind of tracking not just the way people rate attractiveness of other people, but also looking at actual relationships, we tend to find that people engage in relationships, friendships, as well as intimate relationships with people who tend to have a lot of overlapping genetic material. There have been some interesting studies where they actually, pulled together bunches and bunches of couples, and they took, DNA swabs from them, and they looked at the percentage overlaps in their genetic their distance heritage. And you can kind of, there's fancy math involved. I'm not going to go into it. But people tend to end up in relationships with people they have more genetic similarity to than different. Now, of course, there are always exceptions, loads of them. But on average, what we see is that people tend to kind of hang out in their own genetic pool. And I'm not saying that they're drawn to incestuous relationships. That's not what we're talking about here at all. It's overlapping commonalities in genetic background. So if you have submitted your DNA to Ancestry.com, for example, they show you kind of where your genes extend from geographically over the millennia of time. And it can kind of show you what's your genetic makeup. So for me, for example, I'm like mostly Scottish and English in terms of heritage. I'm like super white. And there's a nugget of Ireland in there. There's some French and German, but mostly Scottish and English. And, who am I married to? a guy whose dad is from Scotland. It was not an exclusion criteria, but it's just kind of an example. We do tend to land in relationships with people who have more genetic overlaps. What we find is this genetic similarity tends to lead to greater perceived similarity. Some of it is based on appearance. Some of it, though, is also just an artifact of where you live. We tend to live in places that are dominated by people who share the same kind of genetic background. So that's also then going to interact with propinquity, mere exposure, similarity, and so on. So genetic similarity is part of the puzzle, but it's not the main driver. The research seems to suggest that there's a complex interaction between genetics and the situational variables like propinquity and similarity. So let's go back to similarity and why it matters. Generally speaking, we tend to think that people who are similar to us in some way are more likely to like us. So if you remember that fundamental attribution error, remember the self-fulfilling prophecy idea, if you think someone is going to like you because you see some surface similarities, you tend to be warmer, more open, more friendly, your face will be happier, and that tends to bring similar things out in other people. So when we perceive similarity, we tend to present ourselves in a more likable way, and other people tend to like us more. At least we believe they will. People who are similar to us also are very, very validating. When you find another person who likes the same quirky things you do, like my husband, when we were dating, he asked me about music, he asked me about sports, but then he asked me, what's your favorite movie? And I said, Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail. And he was like, you are kidding me. So it was very validating. Monty Python is something more strongly oriented to my generation, but we both loved it. And we love we both have weirdly English senses of humor. And that was something very validating for us, because inside our own families, no one else in our families liked the same kind of humor as us. We also tend, if you turn this around backwards, we tend to think negatively about people who disagree with us. And I'm sure in the last, decade, you've had a lot of interactions with people who don't agree with you on what you perceive to be super important issues. We're in a very politically divided time, and when we see someone expressing attitudes that go against our attitudes politically, we tend to make super negative statements about them, unfortunately. And that creates a really, really deeply toxic environment for people. It certainly doesn't allow you space to like them. So that's a big challenge. When you discover new similarities, they tend to fuel a deeper sense of friendship. Like I said, when I met my husband and we discovered the same quirky interests in certain kinds of movies and certain kinds of music, it was very, very affirming. And that kind of solidified our initial interests, and that encouraged us to go deeper into that. We tend to seek out physical closeness to people who are similar to us, and that's even in ways that we may not know we're doing. So we tend to gravitate toward people who are similar in appearance to us and who tend to be rated within our same range of physical attractiveness. Now, this is an interesting finding, but it's been tested in the laboratory in a lot of different ways. So, one study that I remember reading about, they set up a giant social event. Think of a school dance, but in a college environment. They set up this environment, and they let people choose where to sit for a meal. And these were all strangers. So one of the rules of the gathering was you couldn't know anyone. who was also being invited. You can bring your friends. You had to come in cold. The room was filled with strangers, and everybody was a stranger. And what they then mapped out was where people sat. And what they found was that you could go table to table, and people tended to sit with people who were similar in degree of physical attractiveness as rated by an external evaluator, who rank ordered people in terms of attractiveness. So, if you take the crude measure of, from 1 to 10, the 8s, 9s, and 10s tended to hang together. The 5s, 6s, and 7s tended to hang together. The 1 through 4s tended to hang together. Not always, but it was a predictor. So it's like people tend to self-sort in terms of even the most surface forms of physical attractiveness, and put themselves in a zone where they feel most comfortable. And that tends to be with people of an equal level of physical attractiveness. Now, some final thoughts on similarity, because we've spent a lot of time on this. It's really the low-hanging fruit of variables in the study of attraction, because it's easy to manipulate and to test in the laboratory. Similarity is very important. However, there's actual similarity, and then there's perceived similarity. Perceived similarity is far more important. So we have to feel like we are a match. We have to feel like we fit with another person for it to actually be something we can use as a foundation to build a relationship on. Sometimes we will create ideas that increase our perception of similarity. And if you flip that upside down, if relationships get into trouble, we may revise our assessment of how similar we think we are. So you may go in a relationship and you feel great about your partner. You may focus really heavily and often magnify the degree to which you feel similar to this other person. In relationships that are in distress, and those may be the same people who were happy in the past and they're now not happy, they will magnify the dissimilarities and minimize the similarities. Now, you remember that cognitive dissonance theory? That's kicking in here a little bit. So perceived similarity matters a lot. Also, timing matters. One thing that's been found, and remember how I was complaining that a lot of this chapter is the psychology of the first and second date? Here's the thing. Similarity, just like physical attractiveness, is far more important when we are really, or let me back up. Similarity, unlike physical attractiveness, is more important when we are really looking for someone we want to commit to, either in a serious friendship or in an intimate relationship. But particularly for intimate relationships, if we're looking to find someone to commit to for a longer term relationship, we really want those similarities. It's more likely in flings or low commitment relationships, maybe one night stands or hookups, that we will look for somebody exciting. And exciting sometimes is operationalized as different from us. Now, I mentioned physical attractiveness there. Physical attractiveness, and we'll talk about this more in the next video, early in relationships it tends to be more important, but later, less so. So what you're hearing here, I hope, is that when we want to identify someone who we want to make a bigger part of our lives, we look for intentionally the match. We look for the similarities. If we can't find them, it's often the thing that stops us from wanting to be engaged with them. If we're just playing, if we're just dating, just hooking up, just, seeing each other, I forget what the slang phrase for that is right now. But if that's all it is, and you have no intention of going any deeper, differences are far more tolerable. And in fact, may be something that you actively seek out. So that concludes part 1 of Learning Objective 10.1. we'll return to this learning objective in the next video.